everyone, welcome. I'm going to give us just a few seconds here to let everyone join. I see a bunch of people connecting to audio. Majority of everyone that has joined so far has connected, so we'll go ahead and get started. Well, thank you for joining us for Ask the Alliance. The Alliance is a not-for-profit organization whose mission is to bring together communities, companies, and conservationists to improve our lands and waters in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. Last summer, the Alliance hosted its first live webinar series called Breakfast on the Bay, where we united staff expertise with our partners' experience to explore the impact we have on the Chesapeake Bay's health. As our staff continues to grow, our expertise does too. So this year, we're really excited to welcome solely Alliance staff to share their knowledge and passion for what you can do both at home and in your personal life to enjoy and improve the health of the Chesapeake Bay watershed. And you'll have the opportunity to ask the Alliance today. Just a few quick housekeeping items. With the hope for these sessions to be interactive, feel free to join us with your camera on, but please remain on mute. You will have the opportunity to ask questions within the last minutes of our presentation, but you may also submit questions through the chat during our Zoom, and I'll be sure to get those over to our expert today, Jim. So with that, I'm excited to welcome and introduce Jim Kaufman, our Pennsylvania Forest Projects Coordinator, to learn more about bats and how we can benefit from them. So with that, Jim, I'll pass it over to you.
All right, thank you, Lauren. Again, my name is Jim Kaufman. I'm one of two Pennsylvania Forest Project Coordinators with the Alliance for the Chesapeake Bay. And I don't know about the term expert, Lauren. I know some about bats, but I'm going to preface this talk by saying I am by no means an expert on bats. So I'm going to do my best to tell you what I know and to answer some questions that you may have. So again, thank you all for joining. We have a good turnout today as part of our Ask the Alliance series. So with that, we're going to get started and talk about bats, the flying mammals of the Chesapeake. All right, let's see if this works. All right, did my second slide go through, Lauren? Is it looking good?
Yep, looks good.
All right, great. Like Lauren said, a little bit about the Alliance for the Chesapeake Bay for those of you that aren't too familiar with our organization. Our mission is to bring together communities, companies, and conservationists that improve our lands and waters. And we have 4 offices spread throughout the Bay watershed. I work out of the Lancaster, Pennsylvania office. And our vision is for cleaner streams and rivers that we want to flow through resilient landscapes, and they're cared for by the people who live, work, and play within the Chesapeake watershed, which is probably most of us here today. So the 4 pillars of our work, we have an agriculture team that works very closely with farmers and producers to help install conservation and ag-related best management practices to protect our lands and waters. I work as part of the forest team, and we create forests. We plant a lot of trees. We do a lot of riparian buffer plantings. You can see in that picture there, some tree tubes along a stream. And we're trying to clean up the water, prevent erosion, and create more forest habitat throughout the Bay community. We have a green infrastructure team that works primarily in urban communities to create green landscapes and provide trees and vegetation within those communities. And of course, our stewardship and engagement, which is why we're here today to do a talk to provide some educational information and to engage the public. So with that, we'll get into our presentation here to talk a little bit about bats. So first of all, what makes a bat? Despite flying, bats are mammals. Among other characteristics, they have hair and they produce milk, just like us, just like other mammals. They've been around for about 50 million years. And what's interesting about bats is, as a group, they are the only mammals that are actually capable of true flight. They've evolved true wings where they have a thin skin membrane that is stretched over these elongated finger bones. And I'll show you a diagram here in a second. All the bats that we have here in our Chesapeake region are nocturnal, and they utilize echolocation or some type of sonar to navigate and also to capture their prey. There are other mammals out there that have evolved certain methods of locomotion or transportation, but they're not true flyers. Things like colugos, the flying lemurs, or flying squirrels, which we have here in the Chesapeake region, they have these skin folds and they're gliders. They're not true flyers. So here's a really good diagram of a bat that shows how over time that their forelimbs and their fingers and hand bones have evolved to stretch out. They have these membranes that stretch between the bones. And if you look here, you can see really clearly where their thumbs and fingers are, and they utilize this adaptation for true flight. I mentioned that bats use sonar as a method for transportation and also for prey capture. I'm not real familiar with the exact mechanism of exactly how this works, so don't ask me exactly how they do it, but I'm telling you at least this is what they do. They emit a signal that bounces off of objects throughout the environment, and then they receive those signals back, and they use that to gain information about their surroundings and the prey that they're out there chasing. So a little bit of background in biology, that's alliteration there. Our Chesapeake region bats are all what is known as microbats. They're smaller insect-eating bats, and they're nocturnal. There is another group of bats called the megabats, and you might have seen these on documentaries on Discovery Channel or National Geographic. These consist of things like the flying foxes, and there's a picture there of flying foxes roosting upside down, but we don't have any megabats here in our region. Our Chesapeake Bay bats, they're all nocturnal, they're all insect eaters, but some other bat species out there throughout other parts of the world do eat other things. Some are pollinators, that they're feeding on pollen, moving pollen around. Vampire bats obviously eat blood. There are nectar feeders, fish feeders, others that'll even eat birds and mammals. Bats have a very high metabolism. Obviously, they're flying around, so they expend a lot of energy, and it takes a high metabolism to be able to fly. So they need to eat a lot of insects. And I just saw some research that some people did where they identified that a colony of 100 little brown bats, which is a species of bat that we'll talk about, ate 42 pounds of insects in 4 months. So just extrapolate that on the landscape, the millions of bats that are out there or were out there, how many pounds of insects that they consume just in a summer season. Some of our bats are migratory and leave this area in the wintertime, while others hibernate. And something that really surprised me that I wasn't aware of until recently is just how long a lot of our bat species will live. Again, they have a high metabolism, need a lot of food. They're flying, they're migrating, they're hibernating, and they're very small. And yet some of these bats can live 15, 20, or even more years in the wild. So for every year we do a newsletter edition called Forest for the Bats, and we talk about bat ecology and we talk about bat habitat requirements. So just some of the basic needs of bats. They obviously need food, and the primary food that our bats are feeding on are flying insects. They need roost sites, which historically would have been trees. Now, obviously, they're using some man-made structures, but still use a lot of trees. And our hibernating bats need these hibernation sites, which typically are caves or abandoned mines. And within these hibernation sites, the bats are really looking for specific temperatures and humidity, and depending on the species, different species of bats have different hibernation requirements. So some will hibernate in one area, some hibernate individually, some hibernate together. It's really interesting when you look at the hibernation requirements of different species and just how much that varies. So obviously, forest cover is very important for the bat species that we have here throughout the region, because these bats are utilizing forest cover for foraging, which is food acquisition, reproduction, roosting sites, and then their migration corridors. So we need insects on the landscape, we need cover, and those are what are contributing to the reproduction and rearing of young for these bats. Now to get into a little bit about just some general information and some photos of some of the bats that we have here in the region. We break our bats basically into two different groups. We have our resident or hibernating bats, and these are bats that are here year round. They're active during the summer, and then they're hibernating in caves and abandoned mines in the wintertime. And they include species like the little brown bat, the tricolored bat, which we used to call the eastern pipistrelle, the northern long-eared bat, which at one time was called the Keene's bat, the endangered Indiana bat, our big brown bat, and small-footed bat. We have some other species, but those are just some of the more common ones. And then we have a number of migratory bat species that don't hibernate in caves, and they actually fly to southern locales for the winter. And 4 of those species include the red bat, silver-haired bat, hoary bat, and Seminole bat. And that's a picture of a red bat there. So here are just some examples, again, pictures of some of our resident hibernating bats that we have. There's a tricolored bat, northern long-eared, little brown, and small-footed, and big brown. All really neat, really interesting species. All look somewhat superficially similar, but all have very distinct habitat requirements and distinct biology and distinct ecology. I mentioned the Indiana bat. This is a species that has declined significantly. It has been endangered for a number of years, and there are a lot of conservation programs and research projects that are being conducted for the conservation to try to save this species. You can see in the top right picture how this species hibernates in caves. At one time, it was known as the cluster bat, and I believe sodalis, the specific epithet, refers to that either in Greek or Latin, that these are cluster bats, or called cluster bats because they cluster together in big groups on cave faces during the winter time. So talk a little bit about a year in the life of a Chesapeake Bay bat. So not unlike Leslie Nielsen here, as Dracula Dead and Loving It, hibernating bats emerge in the spring. Sorry, I couldn't resist. I had to include a Dracula Dead and Loving It reference. Once the bats emerge in the spring from their hibernaculum, they begin to feed on insects during the evenings and at night, and then they're roosting during the day. And when they're roosting, they're in hollow trees, under the bark of trees, and in a lot of man-made structures like shutters, attics, and chimneys. Females that are pregnant and that are going to give birth, they form gregarious maternal colonies where they group together to give birth and raise young. And again, historically, they would have done this within the forest, on trees, in dead trees. And now they will utilize a lot of these man-made structures as well. Bats will then breed in the fall, and they will return to their caves and abandoned mine shafts or mine tunnels to hibernate, and then they pop out again the next spring and start the process all over again. So I'll talk a little bit now about some of these tree-roosting migratory bats. Again, here are 3 examples of the most common ones that we have in the region: the silver-haired bat, hoary bat, and red bat. And these are great photos here. And I want to disclaimer is none of these photos are mine. So I did a lot of internet searching for good photos. So I'm not taking credit for any of these photos. But our migratory bats, they're actually flying south during the winter. They're not as gregarious. They don't group together. They don't form flocks to fly. They're mostly solitary, and they're roosting in trees along the way. They don't congregate in caves. And what they're doing is they're following these mountain ridges, similar to what hawks and eagles do on their migratory flights. And unfortunately, they are somewhat susceptible to being impacted by wind turbines on our mountain ridges while they're heading south. And here you can see a group of wind turbines and windmills on an Appalachian mountain ridge. And then you can see in the map here, this is the range of the red bat. So you can see where it's spending its summer, and then it's migrating south to spend the summer in spend the winter in warmer locales to the south. Again, another excuse to use a Dracula Dead and Loving It reference here. Vampire bats, we get this question a lot about bats sucking blood or drinking blood. We do not have vampire bats here in the Chesapeake region. The vampire bats are known as leaf-nosed bats, and they are native or endemic to Central and South America. And they don't actually suck blood. What they're doing is they're typically feeding on a sleeping animal. Some feed on birds, some feed on mammals. But what they're doing is they're landing on these animals at night and they're making an incision. And then as that incision bleeds, they're actually lapping up the blood. And this is known as a hemotophagy. So how do biologists study and monitor bats? Well, there's a very old picture of me when I was much younger and much thinner, holding, I believe that was a little brown or a long-eared bat that we captured in a mist net. And what we were doing is we were using what are called mist nets, which I'll talk about in a second, to identify what bats were in this area. And we call this live capture, where we're capturing these animals alive and then releasing them back out to do their thing. And some biologists are doing this. They're doing mark recapture studies, which means they're trying to figure out how many bats are around. And they'll also use radio-telemetry to track their movement. So we would capture bats, put a transmitter on them and release them. Again, I'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. Some scientists are doing hibernaculum surveys where they're physically going into caves in the wintertime to count the number of bats that are in there. And then a relatively new method that has come on the scene that I don't have much experience with is this acoustic monitoring, where you're actually using a machine to listen for the different sounds and calls that bats are making and are able to identify bats in a very non-invasive way, which is really interesting. So here are some photos. Again, none of these photos are mine. These are all internet search photos, but these are biologists that are conducting hibernaculum surveys where they're physically going into the caves and they're counting the number of individuals of different species that are hibernating. And the picture on the top right I thought is really interesting because it's a cluster of Indiana bats where they took a photo and then they applied a little yellow dot to the nose of each individual, and they used that to count how many were in there. And this is used as a tool to monitor populations over time to see if populations are staying consistent, if they're increasing or they're decreasing by looking at total numbers. I mentioned live capture. This is something I have done a little bit many years ago. This is where you set very thin nets up over bat feeding areas, or bat flight areas. The bats, their sonar doesn't detect these thin mist nets and they actually fly into them and get stuck. So we take them out. Again, depending on what we're looking at, whether it's biological sampling, trying to identify species, doing mark recapture, doing telemetry, there's a number of different, there's a lot of different information you can capture here based on what your research goals or objectives are. And capturing bats is a lot of fun, but as they're nocturnal, it leads to a lot of late nights. I mentioned radio-telemetry, and this is when wildlife species are captured and a transmitter is placed on them that emits a signal that allows us to track their movement. So we can look at things like habitat use, home range size, movement patterns, dispersal areas, migratory corridors, and lets us get a lot of information from these animals. Unfortunately, because bats are so small, they require very small transmitters and the battery life isn't that good. So you're limited on the amount of data that you can collect. But here you can see two bats with transmitters that look like they may have been glued to the back. I've never put transmitters on bats, so I don't know exactly how that process works. But you can see a researcher releasing a bat with the antenna sticking out, and then another researcher using an antenna and a receiver to collect the location of that bat. This acoustic monitoring is another great method that I don't know if it allows you to determine how many individuals are around, but at least allows researchers to identify the species that is present. Again, they're using these tools to listen for these bat calls, these bat sounds, and then can actually graphically represent that, and based on what it looks like on a graph to determine what the species is, which is really interesting. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the threats that our bats here are facing. Bat species have been in a significant decline for quite a while. One of the major culprits that most people are familiar with is this white nose syndrome, which I'll talk about here in a second. We're also seeing significant declines in insect populations. And That's not just impacting bats, that's impacting a lot of our songbird species as well. And that's due to increased use of chemicals on the landscape. We mow more than we used to. We are developing at an unprecedented pace. And through the use of herbicides, we are losing pollinators and losing pollinator plants, losing a lot of herbaceous vegetation that would have led to more insects for bats to feed on. The colonies are being disturbed, whether it's winter colonies that are in caves. Caving is something that's popular. Just people going into caves and disturbing bats while they're in their winter roost. And maternal colonies that are trying to raise young in homes and other man-made structures that are getting disturbed. People just have a general intolerance of bats, unfortunately. They're afraid of bats. People kill bats. And there's really no good reason for it other than just a lack of understanding that, bats really aren't anything that we should be afraid of or aren't impacting us as humans negatively. The migratory bats are being impacted along their migratory routes. I mentioned before, again, which I'll talk about here in a second, is that this barotrauma that's occurring to bats as they're trying to fly south through these windmill areas, and obviously the deforestation and development that's occurring along their migratory routes. So white nose syndrome, this is really the big one that's really hurting our resident cave hibernating bats. It's actually a fungus. And it's a fungus that was endemic or native to Europe that somehow jumped here to North America, first identified in 2006 in New York, and since has spread to over 30 states. I believe the theory is that just by recreational cavers going from cave to cave may have brought it here on, their clothing or equipment or something, and it has spread very rapidly. And what this fungus does is, the fungus itself doesn't outright kill the bats, but it grows on their nose and on their wings, and it really bothers them. So it disturbs them during their winter hibernation. They wake up in the wintertime, they fly around because they want to get this fungus off of them. It bothers them, it's annoying. And while they're out flying around, they're burning up very precious fat reserves that they've stored through summer of feeding. And obviously in the wintertime, there's no insects out there for them to feed on. So the longer that they're active, the longer that they're out, they burn up more of these fat reserves and ultimately, unfortunately, die. So because of this, biologists are seeing huge mortality events where 90% or more of populations hibernating in caves are dying. Just anecdotally, I talked to a bat biologist a number of years ago, and he said they were, before white nose, they were going into some caves and counting 40, 50,000 little brown bats. And after white nose, they'd go into those same caves and they were counting 6 or 7. And I don't mean 6 or 7,000, but like it went from 40,000 to 6 or 7 individuals. That had just an incredibly precipitous decline, has killed millions and millions of bats where it has spread. And it's been really, really unfortunate. Here's a good picture by Greg Turner, who's with the Game Commission, of some bats that had been affected by white nose, had come out and then died in snow. One of the things that biologists are doing to try to limit the spread and to try to protect bats in their winter hibernacula is closing off access to caves and abandoned mines. Here you can see some gates and bars that have been put up. These are probably important bat hibernation sites. So they're putting these gates up to try to keep people out, not only to limit the spread of white nose, but also to limit disturbance and impacts to bats in the winter time. I mentioned this barotrauma from wind turbines. Our tree roosting or migratory bats, silver-haired bats and red bats, they're following these mountain ridges south to migrate. And the windmills don't look big until you get real close to them. They're actually gigantic. And as those turbines are spinning, the bats aren't getting outright hit by the turbines, but their bodies are being impacted by the change in pressure. And again, I'm not real good at physics, so I can't really explain how this occurs, but basically their bodies are popping from this change in pressure and this huge trauma that they try to fly around or through the windmills, and there's just so much pressure there that it kills them. So The good news there is there's research being done to see when and where these bats are flying. And biologists, and I went to grad school with a guy that was doing research on this so he could provide recommendations to the power companies to say, this is when the turbines should be on and this is when they should be turned off. So the good news there is biologists are working closely with these companies to try to figure out when the bats are using these areas and make sure that the turbines aren't spinning during those times to protect the migrating bats. So I mentioned before that bats are often feared. Bats are a rabies vector species, like a lot of other mammals. People are afraid of them for that reason. They think that they transmit diseases. They're worried about getting bit by bites or bit by bats. And they're also worried about the messiness that bats cause when they utilize our man-made structures. A lot of bats, again, end up in homes, either for roost sites or maternal colonies. And you can see here how many bats can end up inside an attic, and they do create a mess of guano as they're defecating while they're roosting. So that certainly is a serious consideration as a homeowner or a structure owner. So we get this question a lot: how do I safely remove bats from my home? So I think the best solution to this is, rather than removing them, is to, if you don't want bats in your home, prevent them from getting in there in the first place. So if you have dilapidated structures, cracks, holes, close them up, seal them up, plug them up, and you can create additional habitat structures to try to encourage bats to use those other areas rather than your home. So plant trees, put up bat boxes, allow them to use barns, pole buildings, outbuildings, that sort of thing. Bats that we're finding in our homes and attics are typically just roosting during the day in the summertime. Maybe individual, maybe a couple individuals, but they can also be big maternal colonies and can cause a mess with their defecation. So what I would recommend is, if you have bats inside that you don't want to be there, once they leave in the evening, you can plug the holes up to ensure that they don't get back in. So the unfortunate side effect of that is it could disrupt the colony, especially if it's a maternal colony, and could lead to mortality. Sometimes the young don't go with the females, sometimes they do. But on the other hand, bats could potentially find habitat elsewhere, other roost sites, and survive. So again, that's up to you. It's an option. But at least if you're letting them get out of the house and you plug up the hole, you give them an opportunity to survive. But the best solution for that is to just tolerate them throughout the summer. If they're dropping the guano, you put a tarp there, put bags, try to collect it. And then once those bats leave and go to their hibernaculum for the winter, then plug the holes. There are licensed professionals out there that are trained on how to remove bats safely and effectively, and have kind of a system of what to do and where to take these bats. So again, that's another option. This is a great graphic, again, that I didn't develop, found it online, but it shows a scenario where there's a lot of opportunity for bats to roost within a home or a structure. They like going down chimneys if they can. They'll go under soffits, under gable vents, broken screens, behind downspouts. So, I think this is a really good example to use this graphic and think about your structures. If you don't want bats, and again, if you want bats using your home, that's great. I personally live in a stone home and I have bats roost here all around throughout most of the summer, and it's wonderful. But yet I have the holes plugged, so they're not actually physically getting inside the house. But if you want to at least deter bats or discourage them from utilizing your structures, look at this graphic and try to assess your house and figure out where you could prevent the bats from roosting. Now, if you want bats and you're trying to make your home or property more bat friendly, like me and like many others that I assume are here today, I think the number one thing you can do is just tolerate the presence of bats. If you have roosts or maternal colonies, don't disturb them. Let them do their thing. Know that you're contributing to their survival and doing a good thing for conservation. Reduce or do away with using insecticides. The more insects that we kill, the less insects that are out there in the landscape for bats to eat. Farmers use a lot of insecticides. If you own ag land and you're renting to a farmer, or if you are a farmer yourself, reduce the amount of insecticides that you use to encourage more insects out there for bats to feed on. One of our favorite things to tell property owners and landowners, basically to create habitat for almost any wildlife species, is to just mow less. Mowing less allows grass to grow, allows more plants to grow, herbaceous vegetation, flowering plants, and again, leads to more insects. So the less you mow the grass, the better for many wildlife species, including insects and including bats. Pollinator habitat, insects really love leafy vegetation and not just grass. I mentioned herbaceous vegetation. So there's typically more insects when you have leafy vegetation, forbs, wildflowers than there is in something that's a monoculture of grass. So plant pollinator habitat, sow wildflower seed in your yard, have pollinator gardens, again, more insects for bats to eat. Bat boxes can be a great way to create roost sites for bats. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. Planting trees, again, more trees on the landscape, more roost sites, more insect, more bat forage. If you have dead trees on your property, you don't have to cut them down. I spend a lot of time trying to convey that to landowners that we work with, where dead trees are surveyed. They have a lot of value for wildlife, whether it's woodpeckers, flying squirrels, bat roost sites, even mammals like fishers. I mean, the list goes on and on. There's a ton of wildlife species that utilize dead trees, or what we call snags. So if you have dead trees on your property, as long as they're not in danger of falling on your house or on a power line or something, leave them stand and let them do their thing naturally. If you have to cut a tree down, do it in the wintertime, because most of the bats that are going to be roosting there in the summer will not be there in the wintertime. And another huge thing is cats really like catching bats, and feral cats that spend time outdoors, should be kept indoors if you can. Obviously, stay out of caves. A lot of, at least caves on public land now, are closed to access. Like I mentioned before, this can disturb hibernating bats, transfer diseases. So please stay out of caves if you can. And don't use bug zappers. Again, bug zappers kill a ton of insects. And I keep reiterating this point, but more insects equals more food for bats. I'm not going to talk too much about bat houses and bat boxes, about what type of box works best, how to install them, where to install them. And to be honest, I don't have a good answer for that. I can tell you anecdotally that I have seen bat boxes that have been up for a long time that bats never colonize, and I've seen bat boxes that are full of bats all the time. Every landowner or farmer that I've ever met with that has boxes, I ask them, and some say the bats love them and use them, and others say the bats never use them. So I have a website here. Bat Conservation International has a really good website and a really good page on how to install bat boxes, where to install them. So I'm going to defer to them. Please check out their website to get more information on the specifics of bat box or bat house installation. My general advice is, other than spending money to buy them or to get the materials to put them together, they certainly can't hurt anything. So sometimes they seem to work and sometimes they don't, but might as well put one up and see what happens. But go to this Bat Conservation International website and they'll tell you exactly which way to set them up to give you your best chance for bat usage. If you are a forest landowner, or you have a big property with a lot of woodlands, you should consider bats and bat ecology when you're doing a timber operation or applying forest management practices. There are a lot of local, federal, and state agencies that can help you to manage your forest lands. I listed a few here. Our Game Commission here in Pennsylvania, Maryland DNR, Department of Conservation Natural Resources in Pennsylvania, and the federal NRCS agency. They have funding, they have professionals, and they have programs that can help you apply forest management practices and develop forest management plans on your property. And rather than just doing timber operations and high grading and trying to harvest timber for value, you can still get value from your timber, and you can consider wildlife at the same time by applying a forest management plan. So I'm encouraging anybody that's a forest landowner to work with a professional forester, work with one of those agencies, develop a plan, harvest timber to make some money, but yet also ensure that you're managing your woodlands for wildlife. And you can specifically consider bats in those management plans. Say, when you're writing this, when you're developing practices to apply, consider bats and do things like retaining roost trees. Here's a picture of a shagbark hickory. Bats love roosting up under the rockers on the bark of that shagbark hickory. So that's something that a forester could put in your management plan to retain shagbarks, retain other species that bats are using heavily, retain dead snags, again, that bats would use. A lot of the timber jobs that I've been involved in, especially within like Indiana bat range, where we are forced to consider Indiana bats because of their endangered status, we'll do things like harvest these trees in the wintertime when we know the Indiana bats aren't there and using them. Our habitat initiatives that we're doing as part of the forest team with the Alliance, I think it goes without saying that planting trees is a huge benefit for bats. Bats really like foraging over riparian areas, which are stream corridors. There's a lot of insects along streams, a lot of mosquitoes, midges, flies. If you've ever walked along a creek in the summertime and got bit, you know how many insects are there. So our reforestation programs that we're doing are having a huge benefit, not only for our water resources, for the bay, and for other local wildlife, but for bats as well. And we do a ton of work in areas that are very intensive agriculture, such as Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. And these are areas where we are creating corridors along streams. We're creating forest that has been gone for 200 plus years, and we're creating more habitat for bats. So again, more trees equals more insects equals more bats. So it's been really rewarding to be a part of this and know that we're doing some really good work that has a ton of different benefits, both ecologically and environmentally. So with that, I'll leave you with two neat quotes that I found here on the internet. One says, "Until mankind can extend the circle of his compassion to include all living things, he will never himself know peace." And I thought that was really appropriate. And I like these advice from a species thing. I have a couple on my fridge, but advice from a bat says to trust in your senses, spend time just hanging with your friends, get a grip, enjoy the nightlife. Sometimes you just got to wing it and guano happens. So I'll close with that. And I guess, Lauren, I'll turn it over to you if we want to. I know we had some questions come in. We can try to look at those or see if you want to open it up for any live questions.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Jim. This was incredible. I really appreciate the bat advice there. Yes, we had a few questions that came in. I feel like you did a great job throughout the presentation kind of answering these questions. I guess the biggest thing it seems like maybe to ask here is there any huge hazards if bats are kind of roosting in your attic? This seems like a common, thing that can happen to people. I know you kind of mentioned if you don't want them in your house, kind of seal up those holes and places they can creep in. But if bats are already kind of roosted in your attic, should you try to take active measures to remove those, or should you just kind of leave them and let them go?
I think it just depends on your personal preference and your personal tolerance for bats. Again, I am like anyone else. I'm a realist where, we want to provide habitat. We want to be good stewards, want to have good conservation, but yet, I don't want a pile of bat guano in my attic either. So, I understand there's a balance there somewhere. And I think, you do the best that you can. And if you have that issue, I think that calling a licensed professional is probably the best route, and saying, what are my options? What should I do? And, rather than just outright killing them all, trying to figure out a best solution that works for you.
Yeah, I think that's great. Kind of along the same lines as that, and as far as you are aware, Jim, is there any kind of bat-borne diseases that if they are roosted in your attic that you should sort of be concerned about? I mean, I'm going to speak from experience. I grew up with a house that also had bats roosted in the attic, and knock on wood, I don't think I have any issues from that, but I'd love to hear what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I don't know specifically. I mean, like I said, bats are rabies vectors that, rabies is spread through saliva and through bites. But I'm sure that their feces has pathogens in it, just like mice or rats or, anything else. So again, I can't say any specific diseases, but I'm sure there's bacteria, viruses, protists, other pathogens that could potentially negatively impact human health. So that's certainly a consideration. Yes, I don't think there's any concern related to that if you have bats outside, but I think being inside the house somewhere that could be an issue. Yes.
Thank you. We appreciate that. You also kind of touched on this during the presentation, but another question was around, is there any kind of benefit to which types of trees you're planting outside?
Yes, there is. And again, I think just generally speaking, if you're just a landowner that has a few acres or you have a small yard or small property, I don't think you necessarily need to worry about specific tree species. I think just doing things like mowing less, having more flowers, providing more herbaceous vegetation and planting trees in your yard and being tolerant of having bats around, I think that's the best thing to do. Now, as far as specific species go, if you have 30 acres of forest, 100 acres of forest, and you're doing a habitat management project, timber operation, then yes, I think species are more important, but it's hard to say, depending on where you are, what bat species you have there, what your forest composition is. That's where you work with that professional local forester that can, identify those species and identify your objectives and make more specific recommendations for tree species to manage for.
Thanks. Another question here is kind of around bats, as far as kind of two questions. One of the questions was, do any bats pollinate? Are bats pollinators?
Yes, they are. Not our bats. We don't have any bats that either eat pollen or drink nectar or do any pollination here that I'm aware of. I know there are bats out there that do, but to be honest, I don't know where, and I don't know the species, and I really don't know anything about them. So I'm sorry about that.
I don't know. I mean, yeah, not in our watershed at least.
No, they're out there and they do, but right.
Yep.
Right.
Great. This is kind of a trick question, maybe a little bit. Is there any way to encourage bats to eat mosquitoes? I'm gonna see if we have Jim here. Let's see. Are you there, Jim? Can you hear us?
Yeah, am I still there? Can you see me?
Yep, you're good.
Okay, I told you I was worried about having this.
Hey, you made it through the whole talk just about.
Good. To be honest, no, I don't think there's anything specific that you can do to encourage bats to eat mosquitoes other than to have bats around. I mean, bats like eating mosquitoes. They eat a ton of them. The more bats, again, it doesn't seem like a small animal eats a lot, but look at that study where 100 little brown bats combined in 4 months in one area ate 42 pounds of insects. So it's certainly, again, extrapolate that over the landscape, it certainly adds up.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Jim, I think this was incredibly helpful. I think you answered a great deal of other questions throughout the presentation that we had submitted beforehand around bat houses and how long bats live and all the great tidbits you shared. So we really appreciate that. Yeah, so I just wanted to send a big thank you to Jim, a big thank you to everyone who joined us today from myself on behalf of the Alliance. We really appreciate you being here. Just so everyone does know, following this call, you will receive an email from me. So if you have any questions, you can feel free to reply directly to that email. I'm happy to answer what I can or share them with Jim or point you in the right direction. And then, like I said, you'll also have a link to the recording. So if you'd like to rewatch this or share it with your family and friends, you're welcome to do so. It was great having everyone today, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Thanks again, Jim.
Thank you, Lauren. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in.